Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Stephen Burt. I'm the Field Director here at NQA, and the webinar this afternoon is going to be one of a series of webinars that we've already done and that we plan to do around sustainability. So this particular webinar is going to focus on the verification audits that we do for carbon verification audits, so greenhouse gas inventory verification audits, and PAS 2060 carbon neutrality verification audits. And the purpose of the webinar is to really answer any questions that you might have. I'm making an assumption to some extent that if you're attending this webinar, then you've already attended some of our previous ones, or you've looked at some of our previous ones on our website, which relate to what greenhouse gas inventory is and what carbon management is and what carbon neutrality is. So this one very much will be focused on the questions that you might have based on the experience that we have of conducting the verifications itself. So just in terms of what we'll run through, I should point out firstly this, some of you may have been expecting my colleague Claire Braham to be delivering this webinar. Unfortunately, she can't make it, so I've kind of stood in at relatively short notice to do this. And also the webinar has been recorded today, and the slides from the webinar and the recording from the webinar will be emailed out to all the attendees. It will be next week now before we get a chance to do that. So we'll run through very briefly, I think, what NQA's services are around greenhouse gas inventory and PAS 2060 carbon neutrality verification. And then most importantly, we'll look at what some of the common questions are that have arisen through the verifications that we do, what some of the common findings from the verifications that we do are, some of the top tips based on our experience to make the process as easy as possible. And if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat box and you can enter your questions in there. Feel free to do that as we go, or feel free to leave it until the end, and I'll do my very best to answer those if I possibly can. But firstly, an introduction to myself. So as I mentioned, I'm Stephen Burt. I am the Field Director at NQA, so I look after all of our auditors and all of our carbon verifiers. My own background, I did a master's degree in environmental management and technology way back in the mid-1990s, a long time ago now. And really I've worked in industry and consultancy and now in the certification industry ever since, primarily on environmental and energy and carbon work. So I'm one of the lead greenhouse gas verifiers at NQA. So I'm out and about delivering verification audits to companies regularly. So I've been with NQA for about 13 years or so now. NQA is a certification body, so very, very highly regulated industry. UCAS, United Kingdom Accreditation Service, govern everything that we do. You know, we deliver a number of different sustainability services: ISO 14001 environmental management, ISO 50001 energy management, as well as a whole raft of others. But today we'll focus on the carbon verification work that we do. So just firstly, an overview of how NQA services fit in with the achievement and the planning for net zero. So we offer a couple of main services. The first is greenhouse gas inventory verification, which is primarily focused on a standard called ISO 14064-1, which is a standard for quantifying and reporting your carbon emissions, an international standard. So we offer verification against greenhouse gas inventory that you might do. A step beyond that would be the verification work that we do around carbon neutrality. So that's primarily focused on a standard called PAS 2060, which is a publicly available specification, which at the minute is the only internationally recognized standard for carbon neutrality. There's another one in the pipeline. ISO themselves, the International Standards Organization, will produce international standard for carbon neutrality, which will be ISO 14068. but that's still another couple of years away. So for the minute, PAS 2060 is the only standard, internationally recognized standard that's available for carbon neutrality. And both of those will help businesses, our clients, we hope, on their journey towards net zero. So as you know, the government targets are for the UK to be net zero by 2050. Many companies, probably your own and certainly NQA, will have set your own internal targets to be net zero probably prior to 2050. So the journey towards net zero, greenhouse gas inventory is a key part of that. Carbon neutrality is a potential part of that, but both are certainly stepping stones towards the net zero targets that we all have to work towards. So firstly, and again briefly, what is the greenhouse gas inventory work that we do? So it's a service which is assessed against ISO 14064-1. That standard is titled the specification with guidance at the organisational level for quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. In other words, it provides you with the specification for actually putting numbers on and calculating the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the work that you do. When our clients request carbon footprint verification or greenhouse gas protocol verification, we would be looking at that type of assessment. So essentially, we as an independent regulated third-party certification body will offer the service of being able to verify your greenhouse gas inventory or carbon footprint, if that's what you would prefer to call it. And it's worth pointing out that ISO 14064-1 is one of 3 standards in that series. 14064-2 is about project level quantification, so primarily carbon sinks, and 14064-3 provides guidance for organisations like us on how to go about doing the verifications themselves. So that's greenhouse gas inventory. PAS 2060 is the standard for carbon neutrality, as I mentioned. It's a standard that takes businesses through 4 different stages. So it goes slightly beyond the greenhouse gas inventory work. So step number 1 is to calculate your carbon footprint, and that is essentially the greenhouse gas inventory piece that we've discussed already. So you may, under the PAS 2060 requirements, you could use ISO 14064-1 to calculate that carbon footprint. You can also use other tools such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is another internationally recognised tool that you can use to measure your carbon footprint. With PAS 2060, however, we go a few steps further. So step number 2 is to reduce the carbon emissions. So once you've quantified them in PAS 2060, the next step would be to establish a carbon management plan to allow you to target and aim to reduce and improve your carbon performance. So that's a key part of PAS 2060, is the mandatory requirement to improve your carbon emissions. Step 3 in PAS 2060 is to offset your residual carbon emissions. So once you've measured them, once you've reduced them as far as you can, you then have the requirement to procure carbon offsets, which come in various guises, and to offset those carbon emissions using those carbon offsets. So this isn't you offsetting the carbon emissions yourself. This is about the finance that you provide by procuring those carbon offsets being invested in projects which reduce carbon that would otherwise be produced. So it's offsetting, but it's not within the boundaries of your own organisation. After you've offset your carbon emissions, that's you're able to claim carbon neutrality at that stage, and we'll verify that you're carbon neutral. And the last stage is to document and validate. So that's where NQA would come in to actually do the verification. use the documentation that you produce, test it, and verify that all's well and that you're in compliance with PAS 2060. So in summary there, greenhouse gas inventory services is one element of the verification services that we provide. PAS 2060 is another. They're very complementary to each other, and both are aimed towards the achievement of net zero. So what's driving all of this? There's a number of different drivers. There's a number of different benefits that can be realized through adoption of greenhouse gas inventory and carbon neutrality. The first one, if you're using an organization like NQA, it means that the work that you do can stand up to scrutiny. It can provide reassurance against greenwashing. It provides credibility, it provides robustness, and it provides transparency. So we go through accreditation process. We're a highly regulated industry. We're completely objective and independent, and have a long track record of that. And you know, we have a brand name which is very high profile as well. So you know, achieving verification for the claims that you make around your carbon is very important from a credibility point of view for competitive advantage. Another thing to think about is supply chain pressures. So you no doubt, and NQA as well, have received supply pressures within our supply chains from our customers, asking us what we're doing to move ourselves towards net zero. And you may or may not, if your company holds contracts with the government, then there's a procurement policy note 0621, which specifies if the government award contracts of more than £5 million per year to you, then they'll make decisions about the procurement of your products or services based on carbon, and they'll require you to quantify your carbon emissions and report on those if you want to be a part of that procurement process. And that also includes the National Health Service. So from April 2023, this year, the National Health Service will also be working in their procurement processes to PPN 0621. You'll also have your own customers. So one client I was working with very recently, one of their major clients, which was an OEM in the aerospace sector, sent them questionnaires and required them to calculate their carbon and also to report their carbon publicly and transparently. And they also required them to have external verification around their carbon as well. So there'll be supply chain pressures coming from customers, certainly. The UK government also has a net zero strategy. You can download that. It's 100+ pages of happy reading. But essentially the UK government is aiming to have the country net zero by 2050. So in time, that net zero strategy will result in changing pressures and a changing legislative environment, particularly for all businesses, to encourage and mandate and require businesses to get involved and work towards net zero themselves. Cost savings and efficiencies are obviously a clear benefit from it, which helps with competitive advantage. If you're managing your carbon, you're reducing your energy, and generally speaking, you're making cost savings. And then, as importantly as them all, of course, is climate change mitigation. So we all have a role to play, calculating our carbon emissions, reducing them, potentially offsetting them, and having that verified to ensure that you're not marking your own homework and it's a robust process is important in making sure that, you know, we as humans have a planet, a comfortable environment that we can thrive in. There's also statutory, so legal requirements in the UK, which involve mandatory reporting as well. So some of you may have a reporting requirement under ESOS, the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. At the minute, we've just entered ESOS Phase 3 in 2023, and for Phase 3, carbon reporting is optional. For phase 4, which will take place in 2027, carbon reporting will be mandatory. So for all of you who work in a company which has an ESOS obligation, which a lot of us do, carbon reporting will become mandatory anyway. There's also the SECR, which is the Streamlined Energy Carbon Reduction Commitment, and they also require carbon reporting on an annual basis within directors' reports when they're submitted. And there's the CCA or the CCLA, which is a climate change levy agreement. So some of you will have agreements, your companies will have agreements with their trade associations to receive discounts in your energy bills and the tax on your energy bills, climate change levy on your energy bills, in return for reducing your energy consumption. And the CCA, the regulations around that will also mandate carbon reporting in the near future. And lastly, the last statutory instrument is a UK ETS, which is the UK Energy Trading Scheme. So at the minute, the UK ETS applies only to sort of what they call prescribed processes, so very large industrial installations and aviation as well, actually. But the UK ETS thresholds will begin to reduce down with the aim of capturing more businesses under those, which will again require greenhouse gas inventory preparation and the trading of emission trading schemes. So there's legislative drivers as well. There's also, you can voluntarily prepare for potential future legislation. So as I mentioned, the UK government net zero strategy makes an interesting read, because it lays out what they will do in terms of legislation to make sure that as many businesses as possible begin to think about and begin to quantify carbon. And it's also important from a risk mitigation point of view. So, you know, investors, customers, other stakeholders, including employees, all want to be involved with business and industry and companies which take carbon seriously. So again, quantifying the carbon and having that independently verified assists with that side of things. So lots of benefits and drivers. Changing landscape into the future as the UK encourages businesses to get more involved. So we can see that coming. Now is a great time to begin thinking about that and getting involved in it. So some of the common questions which have arisen from, in my experience, from the verification audits which we undertake. I'll just work through them one by one, a couple of minutes on each one. First question, is NQA accredited to do the verifications that we do? So the answer to that for PAS 2060 is almost. UCAS, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, they govern everything that NQA do, and everything we do is aligned with their requirements. For PAS 2060, NQA are one of 3 organisations which have taken part in the UCAS accreditation pilot scheme for PAS 2060. And we're on the very cusp, we're at the very end of the process now. So any day now, we're expecting that accreditation to be with us. Another question might be, do you need a consultant? That's entirely up to you. A consultant is an extremely valuable people to engage because they have the experience of helping to quantify your carbon. And helping to interpret the requirements of PAS 2060 and ISO 14064-1. Almost all the clients that we work with will use a consultant. Occasionally, a client might do it themselves, but it will take a great deal of their time to do so. So if you're looking for a reputable consultant who can help you, NQA operate a program called our Associate Partner Program, or APP, and we can provide you with 3 consultant contacts that can help you if you want to go down this route. NQA do not provide consultancy. We come in at the end of the process and do the verification. We do not provide advice or guidance or assistance in how to do the quantification. Another question which frequently comes up is, you know, do I need to include all of our emissions? Some of them are very difficult to quantify. The integrity of what we do at NQA means that we would encourage you to quantify as many and as much of your carbon emissions as is possible. There is a slight get out clause, particularly in PAS 2060, where it suggests that if it's not technically feasible, if it's not practicable, or it's not cost effective to quantify some of your carbon emissions, then that's a justification for not doing it, and you can go down that route. It would be relatively rare for us to accept in a verification that that was the case. You know, we would hope that if that was the case, you would still go down the road of best estimate for your carbon emissions, and you would include those and overestimate those as well, given that you're estimating. So it is difficult to quantify some of your carbon emissions. Some of the conversion factors you can use to convert your activity into carbon help with that greatly, and I'll talk about that in a second. What does a verification process look like, and how long will it take? So question 4. At NQA, we follow the UCAS accreditation rules, so we undertake our verifications. The first stage is a pre-verification, and that's a relatively short visit where we will essentially make sure that there's no big gaps in your data, and we'll essentially do a sort of state of readiness assessment to make sure that you're ready to go for the main verification. And then the second stage in the process is the main verification, which is a longer process. And at that stage, we will test the data that you present us with. We'll scratch the surface of it very deeply in some occasions, and scratch all the way back to the original data source itself and make sure that that data is accurate and correct. And then finally, because of our requirements to adhere to ISO 14064-3, which is the standard which specifies how we should undertake verification visits, we will do an independent post-verification review as well. So that would be somebody in NQA who hasn't, a lead greenhouse gas verifier in NQA, who hasn't been involved in the main verification, checking the work to make sure it's correct. So a real belt and braces approach around the verification, which is why it's you know, at the pinnacle of the credibility that you can achieve when it comes to your carbon emissions. How long will it take? That really depends. We have a formal contract review process, as you would expect, and the categories around determining the number of days and therefore how much it will cost to have NQA do a verification for you include you know, how many greenhouse gas emission sources, sinks, reservoirs you have, what size of organization you are, how many sites you have, and so on. So you know, we provide quotes based on a standard contract review piece. Question number 5 often arises: how much detail will we go into when we're doing the verification process? So all the verifications that we plan, it's a risk-based approach that we take. So we spend more time, as you would expect, scratching the surface of the data, which is the biggest emission source, and less time scratching the surface of the data, which are the smallest emission source. Generally speaking, we sample as close to 100% as we possibly can, depending on how much data you have, but we'll focus the verification effort into the most important carbon emission sources. And you know, often we'll take the data that you provide and we'll work our way back all the way through to the original data source and compare and contrast the two to make sure that everything's okay. Question number 6 would be: who will undertake the verification? So at NQA, we have a team of lead greenhouse gas verifiers, all highly trained, highly experienced people with long careers in carbon and energy management. So you can be assured that the person who will undertake the verification, somebody like me, knows what they're talking about and has been highly trained and adheres to the standards that that are required by the accreditation that we have. Question number 7, should you procure carbon offsets if it's PAS 2060, the carbon neutrality standard? Should you procure those before going ahead for verification? In short, no, because experience tells me that when a company goes through the verification process with NQA, the number you start with will not be the same as the number that you finish with, i.e. the number of the quantity of carbon. Because, you know, with a fresh pair of eyes and expert eyes looking at it, often that number changes. So don't buy carbon offsets until, if you're going through the verification process, the final carbon figure has been agreed between yourselves and NQA. And last common question, how do you proceed with organising a verification? Well, if you go onto NQA's website, you'll find links there, quote request forms. Our sustainability manager, Amber Dixon, manages that side of things, and she's always available to speak to you, as am I, if you wish to proceed down the route of formal verification. But first stop should be the NQA website, and you can get the detail from there easily enough. There's a sustainability microsite in there which contains all the details. Some of the common findings then. So we have a long period of time under our belts now of doing carbon verification work, including with me personally, and generally speaking, there tends to be common findings at each of the different verifications that we do. So there's maybe half a dozen or so. An important one is to make sure that the entity is correctly defined. So the entity in this respect is it's a phrase that's used in PAS 2060. Essentially, it means what is being verified. Is it a company? Is it an organization? Is it a charity? Is it a country? Is it a government? Is it a product, you know, or a service? It can be any of those things. But if you very carefully read the clause in ISO 14064-1 and the clauses in PAS 2060, they'll help to define that. So it's important for credibility purposes to avoid any accusations of greenwashing, that the entity is very clearly defined, so that the final output, which is the verification opinion, the certificate that ends up on your wall saying you've been verified, is correct and can't be misinterpreted. That's a key thing. And very similarly, it's very important that the subject is correctly defined. So again, there's a definition of subject within both ISO 14064-1 and PAS 2060. But essentially what it means is what are the boundaries and the scope of what we're looking at. So if you have several sites and you only want to include one, for example, in the verification, that would be setting the boundaries to that site only. If you had certain elements of your supply chain that you wished not to include for whatever reason that might be, then, you know, the boundaries and scope must very, very clearly define that. So the boundaries and the scope, the subject and the entity would both appear on the verification opinion statement, which is the output from the verification process, the certificate, if you like. But it's important to point out that if you do restrict the boundaries or the scope, then those restrictions and the justifications for them will appear on the verification opinion statement, and therefore, you know, are publicly available information. So this all lends to the credibility of the process and the transparency of the process. Other typical findings, similar to what we've discussed actually, justifications around the claimed exclusions are unsuitable. So if you choose not to include a particular scope 3, for example, upstream transport and distribution, or purchased goods and services, or some of those, then, you know, there has to be a very good justification around that, which can be based on what we discussed earlier, the technical feasibility, the practicability, or the cost effectiveness of gathering that data. So the justifications have to be solid if we were going to accept them as being something that we would consider in the verification process. And then more generally, incorrect use or inconsistent use of conversion factors. So once you've gathered all your data and you know what all the different categories of data are, the next thing is to convert them into carbon. So the UK government, the BEIS, the Business Energy Industrial Strategy Department, I think, they have excellent carbon conversion factors which you can download and use. There's also other sources of carbon conversion factors. For example, the Office of National Statistics have a really good one, which is based on spend, and less commonly the US EPA, US environmental regulator, also publish spend figures, but those are in dollars, so you need to think about, you know, the impact of currency fluctuations and things. But using the correct conversion factors is very important. There's a sort of a principle within all the standards about precluding underestimation, so that's an important thing. If you're having to estimate at any point because actual data isn't available, then those estimations should not underestimate the carbon figure overall. They should be geared up for an overestimation wherever possible. And lastly, the last sort of typical finding that's raised is the sums just don't add up. Excel, wonderful tool, but calculating and converting calculating emissions and converting them into tons of carbon dioxide equivalent is a tricky process. You know, you need to be able to be pretty good with numbers, and you need to be pretty good with Excel as well. It's often Excel. I think I've only ever seen it in Excel or software packages based on Excel. So just making sure the sums add up is an important issue as well, and you know that comes up in many of the audits that we do. So those are the kind of typical areas of the findings that we raise. NQA's approach is very, very constructive. We don't, you know, aim to pick fault or you know, cause you problems in these things. It's very much a partnership approach, and when we identify findings, we can work together to make sure that those findings get closed out before the final stage in the verification itself. So just some top tips, again, based on my experience. So very similar to what we've looked at, actually, is very important at the outset. If you're going to calculate your carbon emissions, be very specific and be very clear when you're defining what the entity and the subject is. In other words, exactly what you're looking at. That needs to be documented, and it needs to be very clear, so that there's no scope for confusion and there's no scope for misleading anybody that's using that information about exactly what it is. Mentioned previously, very important to wait until the verification is complete before you procure your carbon offsets. It's usually worthwhile engaging with NQA as early in the process as possible. As I mentioned, we can assist you to source a good consultant who can help you. And on our website, there's lots of really high value resources free of charge. There's lots of really high value webinars free of charge. We can point you in the direction of those if you don't have them already, which help to set out how best to move forward. We also offer some introductory courses to calculating the greenhouse gas inventory and to carbon neutrality, PAS 2060, if that was something that was of interest to you. And then the last top tip that I would have is, and I've been through this process myself because I did the greenhouse gas inventory for NQA as a company. This was because we operate in compliance with PAS 2060, so NQA are a carbon neutral certification body. But when I gathered all the information, it was coming from dozens, if not hundreds of sources in the first year. Took a long time for me to pull it all together. But what I realized at the time was, instead of having to go through that again the following year, if I put systems in place now and get other people in the business, in the commercial department, the finance department, and the fleet department, for example, and the landlords, for example, to help me to gather the data for the following year, then it'll help me pull the data together for 2022 much more easily than it was when I gathered the data in 2021. So try to put systems in place to make your life easier in following years. It's a good idea to sort of delegate a little bit, because it's an organization-wide effort to gather the data that you need, and usually involves cross-departmental teams of people to pull all that data together. So, you know, trying to do it yourself is going to be a difficult task. Get as many people in the company involved and set up a little system so that they can gather the data as you go, and then the following year it will be much easier to pull it together. Good, so hopefully that's of use. A little introduction to NQA services there, a more detailed overview of the verification activities that we provide and how we go about providing them, but most importantly, the main questions that we're asked and how the process works, the main findings that we see when we're delivering the service to our clients, and our top tips as well for achieving greenhouse gas inventory or carbon neutrality verification. So I'll have a look at the questions now. Please feel free to add any more. We've got a few. So first question is from Mo, who's asked, what's the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero? So it's relatively straightforward to answer, but it might sound a bit confusing. But a company that's operating as carbon neutral is offsetting their carbon emissions via a different source out with the company itself. So a good example, you know, if, for example, you had 100 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and you wanted to offset that so that you could claim to be carbon neutral, then you would procure carbon offsets, and the finance that you spend to procure those carbon offsets would make something happen which wouldn't have happened anyway. So additionality. The thing that would happen would be, for example, a hydro scheme would get built in another country, or trees would get planted that wouldn't otherwise have been planted, and then the carbon offsets associated with that project, you buy them, and therefore you can claim to be carbon neutral. Net zero is really the case where the carbon emissions which you produce are permanently removed from the atmosphere. So there's various ways of doing that. The technology for it, for example, direct air capture, isn't fully mature yet. It will become so over the coming period. But changes in land use, for example, would be a way that you could achieve net zero. But net zero has to take place within a particular boundary. So the UK target for net zero in 2050 is within the country itself. So it specifically excludes the UK being able to spend lots of money to build dams or, you know, hydro schemes or wind generation or whatever in other countries. So net zero is the permanent removal of the carbon that you're responsible for. Carbon neutrality is offsetting the carbon that you're responsible for to a different entity. I hope that makes sense. The second question we have, my company is in the defence sector. Is it applicable? Our product is radio frequency and microwave products. Yeah, definitely. You know, the defence sector, particularly because the contracts in those governments, I know you're attending from India, Hanumantha, but the defence sector in particular, and I'm talking about the UK here, their contracts tend to be with either the big defence contractors, the OEMs, or they tend to be with the government itself. And I've seen directly the supply chain pressure that's been put on carbon by both of those organisations, and PPN 0621 in the UK is the clear example of a defence contractor supplying to the government who will be mandated to quantify and reduce and have verified actually their carbon emissions. Hanumantha is also asking, do I know of any Indian legal requirements? I don't, I'm afraid, but NQA have it's a global operation, so we have several offices in India itself. NQA India would be able to help with that side of things, and also NQA India, I'm almost certain would be able to help with any verification work that you wanted to do around carbon. Catherine is asking, can I ask if you could confirm when NQA will be UCAS accredited for 14064? So we're on the cusp of it. We're really just waiting at the minute for, oh, sorry, I'm thinking past 2060. So past 2060, we've been through the whole process. We have a positive recommendation. We're really just waiting for the certificate from UCAS at this stage. For 14064-1, we have the budget this year, 2023, to seek accreditation for that. So we're hoping to set the ball rolling very, very soon and have that completed probably in the first half of this year if we possibly can. Anna Lynn's asked, can we include in our boundary the outsourced processes? Quite honestly, I would expect you to include your outsourced processes. This is one of the interesting things about the Scope 3, the supply chain pressure. So there's lots of businesses that you'll take responsibility for the carbon emissions that are associated with your activities, and that includes in your supply chain, and that is generally the accepted way to go about it. But one of the things that you might choose to do in future years is to place pressure on your suppliers to take responsibility and accountability for their carbon emissions so that you don't have to. And this is how the supply chain pressure side of things will take effect over the coming years. The more businesses that do this, the more they will ask their suppliers, their outsourced processes, to take responsibility for their own. But at the minute, within ISO 14064-1 and PAS 2060, we would expect your Scope 3 emissions to include your outsourced processes, unless you can demonstrate to us that those outsourced processes are already accounted for by the supplier that's providing you with those processes. Philip has asked, any pitfalls associated with misinterpretation of the conversion factors that depend on market and location differences, and what do you take them to imply? So yep, it's a common one, this one as well, the use of conversion factors. So we have worked with clients who operate offices, for example, in other countries, Qatar, the Netherlands, the Caribbean, United States, various countries. In my experience, the UK conversion factors are the best. I don't think I've seen any other country produce them to the same level of detail and confidence as the UK government does. So when we have different locations and we need to think about the conversion factors there, what I've seen is clients obtaining things like fuel mix disclosures for that particular country, in other words, how they generate their power, and then reverse engineering from the UK fuel mix disclosures back to an appropriate conversion factor for that country. So lots of countries don't have conversion factors available, unfortunately, but we can sort of reverse engineer from the UK. In the absence of those, we can reverse engineer from the UK conversion factor back to the most appropriate factor to use for things like electricity supply. things like gas combustion and fuel combustion, the conversion factors are the conversion factors, so you can use UK ones for that as well. Mo's asking, are there any federal grants to help implement and certify this system? Not that I'm aware of, Mo. I think, Mo, you said, I'm not sure where you're based, but I'm not 100% sure about that. I'm not aware. I'm not aware. Catherine's asking, will the certifications be similar to other ISO standards? Example, ISO 14001, where it's a certification audit, then surveillance for 2 years, so a 3-year certificate. That's a good question. The answer is no. So it has to be annual. PAS 2060 operates on an annual cycle. So we would, you know, it's not, we don't issue a certificate for a 3-year period. We issue a certificate for 1 year. And if you would like your 2nd year's data to be verified, we would come back in and issue a certificate or a verification opinion statement for that year. So it's dissimilar from the ISO standards in that regard. And we don't, you know, work to the usual 3-year certification cycle that you're used to with ISO standards. Okay, I think that's all the questions for the minute. If anybody has anything else they would like to put into the question box, then I'll be happy to do my best to answer it. But I think it looks like that might be all. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you for the great questions as well. Those were really good. We will send the slides and the recording for this webinar out to you. Please feel free to go on our website and make contact that way if you wish to do so. I'll be more than happy to answer any other specific questions, or my colleague Amber likewise would be more than happy to do so. And yeah, thanks once again for attending. All the best. Have a great weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.